Hey folks, I may not sound like it, but I am currently dying on the desert planet of Arrakis to talk about Dunk.
Don't mind if I do!
For those of you not in the know, it is a book that has been adapted into several things, notably movies. It is set in the far future, where we follow the royal family House Atreides, who have been assigned by the Emperor to rule over the desert planet Arrakis, the home of a very valuable substance known as the spice. They must learn to adapt to the planet's harsh landscape, while dealing with the threat of their arch-nemesis, the Harkonnens. But within all that, it is a story about the Atreides' son Paul, who, from his mother's side, was born with special mental abilities, including seemingly accurate premonitions of the future. There's a ton of other shit I'm leaving out, but that's the basic gist if you don't know it. Now initially, my knowledge on what this was pretty limited. All I knew is that it was a thing that had sting, and it also had sandworms and Sean Young, and that's all I really bothered to know for a while. Until about a year ago, where I got into this massive David Lynch kick, where I watched just about everything he directed. But I knew Dune was a peculiar one, as he had little creative control over it, and was a critical and commercial bomb, although it does have a dedicated cult following. So I gave it a watch not knowing what to expect, and I was not having any of it. While it looked cool and it had a good score, it was so overwhelming, confusing, boring. I didn't care what was happening, and it just felt so long. And this was the only Lynch movie I would ever say those words to. So not long after, the trailer for another moving picture of the same name was released. From acclaimed director
Denis Villeneuve.
Director Denis Villeneuve.
And director Denis Villeneuve.
Eventually, I was convinced by people I follow on social media, as well as my mom, to go read the original book, the source of all this madness. And I figured, why not? I need to do some more reading anyway. So I read the first 50 pages or so, and was like, nope, I have no idea what anyone is saying. Being Gesserit, Quithideric, Harkonnen. I later found out there was a glossary at the end of my copy that explains everything, but by that point I wasn't sure if I even wanted to bother. Until a couple months ago, with the movie's release dawning, when I decided, hey, you know what'd be crazy? If I read through that 700-page book I gave up on. So once you get past the honestly not hard challenge of understanding what they're saying, it's a really good story. It's an entertaining read, it's well written, the world building is intriguing. It has this message that I don't really see often about the dangers of martyrdom. About how viewing yourself as more than a man, as some sort of messiah, would absolutely alienate you from your family, or people close to you in general. Also, colonization's probably not a good idea either. You know, it's no wonder these adaptations take so long to make, because this thing's tricky to adapt. I mean, for one thing, it's long, which, while not impossible, doesn't always go over super well. Another thing is that it is dense as hell. You have to learn all these new words and new planets and new concepts and new ways of thinking. I would describe it as kind of a far less accessible Lord of the Rings, because those books were also very dense with world building and terminology. The key difference being that at its core, Lord of the Rings is a simple enough story about a bunch of short people who have to go from one place to another place to do a thing involving a ring. And while it has more going on than that, you're already on board for whatever crazy shenanigans are gonna come. While Dune, on the other hand, is far more political. The plot essentially hinges on a dictator not liking this royal family very much, so he sends them off to colonize some people in an impossible landscape, while the family themselves are at odds with other parties. Like there's a scene in the book where they hold a banquet, and it goes awkwardly. And on a related note, the book is very talky. It is not as action-packed as a regular consumer might think a science fiction property should be. The best point of comparison I could think of is, imagine all those scenes from the Star Wars prequels where they talk about trade federations or whatever, but if they had better writing, and you got Dune. So after familiarizing myself with this very good book, I decided to give another gander to Lynch's not very good movie. But just before I did though, I wanted to go further back. I wanted to learn about the Dune movie that never was. And there was one that never was. It was to be helmed by Spanish auteur Alejandro Jodorowsky of Holy Mountain and El Topo fame. It never got off the ground, but if it did, it would have, 1, been something unique and way ahead of its time, and 2, would have never led to the creation of Alien, among others. Why? How? Watch the documentary Wodorowski's Dune. You don't even need to read the book or anything to enjoy it. All you need to know about it is how one man attempted to create possibly one of the craziest movies ever, and actually got pretty close to making it. If you want to learn the behind-the-scenes scoop of a 14-hour science fiction film starring Orson Welles, Mick Jagger, Salvador Dali, with music by Pink Floyd, then this is the documentary for you. Anyway, with knowledge of the story on brain, I sat right back down to witness Lynch's travesty, the terrible adaptation, the horrendous motion picture, only to discover I actually kinda enjoyed it. Some of that in an ironic way, but also in unironic ways as well. I felt reading the book definitely helped me follow the plot easier, as it really does throw so much at you right from the start. For example, this is one of the first images you see after the opening credits. This is all important information you have to memorize. It isn't something like Star Wars, which eases you into its complex fantasy world with an opening crawl that describes the evil Galactic Empire and the heroic rebel spies. It does open with Princess Irulan talking to you about the spice and stuff, while fading in and out of existence.
I forgot to tell you.
I mean, granted, she did introduce every chapter of the book, but that's not the most weirdly literal thing that this movie does. Actually, in terms of revisiting this film after reading the book, I'm amazed at just how much of it they've kept in. This nearly 800-page book challenged this movie to try to tell its entire story in a runtime of 2 hours and 17 minutes, and the movie just went, "Try me." It really doesn't leave any stone left unturned. Hey, you want to see Baron Harkonnen favor Fade Rotha over Rabin? Here you go. You want Gurney Halleck separated from Paul only for them to meet up again later? That's here. The Fremen's water supply? Here. Shut Up Mapes? Here. Fade and Paul's duel? Here. Usul? Madib? Here. The amount of plot threads and information and other shit they kept from the book is frankly pretty impressive. For comparison's sake, the new Dune is 20 minutes longer than this one. It only covers half the book, and they still had to cut stuff out of it. It does make for a very faithful adaptation, even gaining approval from author Frank Herbert, although it does take a little bit of umbrage over how this movie seems to portray Paul's Messiah complex as a good thing, where in the book, it is not. That said, having so much crammed into your movie does give it the side effect of feeling kinda bloated. I mean, the opening scene when we're introduced to Paul, we are also introduced to Gurney, Thufir, and Yui at the same time as well. And then a couple minutes later, we see Duncan, who appears in like 2 scenes in this. But you know, for the first hour or so of the movie, I wasn't really bothered with how they were telling the story. I mean, they're definitely skimming through the real meat and potatoes of it, but it did keep me thoroughly entertained. I was fine with how the scenes were interpreted. The one part I found consistently weird throughout the whole duration was whenever we hear characters' thoughts suddenly.
One day I will have to do this. Every man who has tried has died. Am I the one? Sleeper must awaken.
It is accurate. Characters do think a lot in the book as well, but there's a bit of a difference between the written word and the visual medium. And I find it funny that the most literal interpretation of that was chosen. And that's not the only interesting interpretation here. While I know he didn't get any final cut or anything from this, the film did feel unmistakably Lynchian to me. Particularly with the editing. So much of the presentation and all the little montages, the fade-ins and fade-outs reminded me of stuff he did in Elephant Man or Wild at Heart. And given that he is the sole credited scriptwriter of this adaptation, there are a few interesting ideas he put into this. Starting with the Guild Navigator. In the book, their description is pretty vague, where not even the Emperor is allowed to see them. But what we do know is that there's some sort of alien humanoid figure. Other visual adaptations of Dune, like the miniseries or the comics, portray them as such. In this, it's a giant testicle monster who lives in a fish tank. And the movie dedicates a minute to a scene of it floating around in space and stuff. Similarly, there's a scene where the Harkonnens torture Thufir by forcing him to milk this cat thing. There is absolutely nothing like this in the book at all. And there are also dogs in it as well. I guess he just really likes animals. Okay, I gotta mention this before I forget. I'm gonna jump ahead here, but I'll be a second. So the new Dune has a scene where the Baron is showing off his new pet, which is this strange spider dog-like creature. And just like Lynch's cat thing, it's on screen for a few seconds, it leaves as soon as it's introduced, and there is not even a single mention of it in the book. I have no greater point with this other than I find it so fascinating that these two distinctly different adaptations of the same source material just dedicate a scene to whatever weird-ass animal they come up with. Makes me wonder what Wodorowski would have done. But that's enough of that, let's jump back to the 80s. So the first act's pretty rushed, but whatever, it still functions well enough as a movie. It's when we get to the second part, after we meet the Fremen, where things start to go haywire. Paul's graduation from being an outsider to a messiah happens in like the span of a minute. Aaliyah's birth just happens. Paul and Chaney get together out of nowhere. I mean, granted, that development was kind of rushed in the book as well, but even that had more of a setup than it did in this. And we get the montage that's just 2 years have passed and all this happened. If anything, this film makes a compelling argument as to why this book is usually adapted into a miniseries, or more than one film. Regardless of whether you follow the plot or not, there's no denying that the visuals of this film are killer. This is Lynch's first and only big-budget science fiction film, and it's a shame because I feel he really has an eye for this genre. Everything about the production design, from the sets to the costumes to the matte paintings, are very impressive looking. Each planet has its own distinctive color palette and aesthetic. Even some of the effects look really good. Some of them. The score by Toto and Brian Eno is pretty rad. And even though nobody's written with the same level of nuance as they were in the book, the actors all do a pretty great job. Kyle MacLachlan in his first role is a good pick for Paul, and Patrick Stewart is really fun as Gurney Halleck. But I think my favorite performances come from the Harkonnens, especially Kenneth McMillan as the Baron, who's just so disgusting and weird, and also Sting is there too. So yeah, 1984, David Lynch Dune, very flawed movie, very hard to get into if you're a newcomer. But also, when viewed under the right mindset, it's a pretty fun time too. And now that leads us to 2021's Dune Part One. Yeah, I know the miniseries and stuff was between that, but like, there's enough to watch. Now, when the trailer of this first came out, I wasn't really sure what to think of it. I obviously haven't read the book yet, and I think this was just after watching Lynch's for the first time. So my general opinion on Dune wasn't super high, and nothing about the general story of the trailer really intrigued me that much. But I was still fairly optimistic in seeing it because I do really like Denis Villeneuve as a director.
Villeneuve.
His work is always very grand and thoughtful and interesting. My optimism only increased after reading the book, making me hopeful that the movie could live up to its lofty ambitions. Now, having seen the movie twice in theaters, I guess I could say it does. It manages to be a satisfying watch for people like me who are familiar with the source material, as well as a good enough time for people who might not be. It doesn't contain any dumb quips or jokey one-liners every 5 minutes. It actually takes its world building seriously. It communicates information to the audience in a way that doesn't feel overwhelming, but still managing to become an engaging and fun blockbuster all the same. It was a smart decision to focus on the characters' emotions and feelings more so than lecturing the audience into how their world works. It actually doesn't completely explain everything either. If you don't know the story, you might still be confused over what a Bene Gesserit is or what Muad'Dib means. But I have a feeling that if they stopped and took the time to explain things like that, it might come off as clunky or unnatural. This is like a far-off future land. Of course the people know what they're talking about. You might not know what exactly a Kwisatz Haderach is, but what you do know is that our main character seems kinda torn up about it. It's obviously very powerful, and it requires a lot of pressure and responsibility that he doesn't feel capable of handling. The aesthetic might feel less visually colorful as it was in the 80s, but it's more than made up for in its scope, in its scale, in Villeneuve's direction, and how he frames shots, and how the visual effects are executed. Again, like the other one, great looking movie. Especially in IMAX, where you could see this tiny little bunker tower over you. Great acting from everyone, like Timothée Chalamet's great as Paul, Rebecca Ferguson's Lady Jessica. Stellan Skarsgård as Baron Harkonnen. Not as silly as the other one, but that's its own thing. Josh Brolin as Gurney Halleck I still found a little weird, but that's mostly because I kind of missed the book version of Gurney who played a lute and sung songs. Patrick Stewart, I could see him do that, but Josh Brolin, he fit him well otherwise. And as an adaptation of half the book, it knew just what to focus on, what to expand on, what to elaborate on. It made changes that made sense, that gave it more of its own identity, that makes me interested to see how it's going to execute the latter half of the story. So I'm perfectly happy with what they do here. Except they do kind of screw over one of my favorite plot lines from the book, from one of my favorite characters, Dr. Yui. So Dr. Yui's betrayal of the Atreides family is something that has been foreshadowed in the book from the very beginning. Right in the second chapter, when we're introduced to Baron Harkonnen, he's laying out his master plan on how to take down the Atreides family, and he mentions how he blackmailed Yui into working for him by lying that he has his wife held captive, even though, unbeknownst to Yui, they've killed her long ago. And this was before you even get to meet Yui in the book. And once you do meet him, his thoughts are just him lamenting over the fact that he has to betray his close friends in order to service those bastards the Harkonnens. So it not only makes you sympathize with Yui early on, but it also adds a level of tension to the story. You know that he's gonna betray them, you just don't know when, or how. And you see him interact with Paul, with the Duke, with Jessica, about how he misses his wife, and how he hates the Harkonnens. So I really loved how that character was written, even though he's technically a minor role. Now Lynch's movie, like a lot of things, skims over the meat of this plotline, with the Baron refusing to specify who the traitor is early on. But there is some foreshadowing to it, and they do keep in one scene with him talking about how he misses his wife. This new one, on the other hand, despite having the longer runtime and only covering the first half of the book, which is when this all happens, did the worst job in adapting it. Like the other one, they withhold information on who the traitor is, but they leave out the scene of him talking about his wife or displaying his loyalty to the Atreides. He has like 2 scenes with Paul and that's about it. So when his betrayal does happen, it comes off as more random, if anything. And that's my real big beef with the movie. For all the many things it really gets right, it really dropped the ball on one of my personal favorite things. On one of the things that makes the book a rich reading experience. The other thing I could point out as being kind of weird are some of the music choices. Now the music in general is cool. It's Hans Zimmer. He mostly does good scores. And this score is no exception. It's really cool and kind of ethereal sounding. Except every once in a while, they would play these kind of tribal chanting sounds, the kind that go at very awkward and inopportune moments. Now this is far more of a personal pet peeve thing. I've just heard that same kind of tribal chanting tunes and stuff like Avatar, or like the Zack Snyder Justice League stuff. I'm just not really a fan of whenever a serious action-y movie does that. I find it a bit too cheesy and it kind of takes me out of the mood they're trying to set. Those are really my 2 big things with the movie, as any other gripes I have with it are minor at best. Because otherwise, it's pretty great. I am so happy this is getting a part 2. I am so happy that it's even doing well at all. It was a pretty popular running joke on my social medias about how this movie was going to fail. Because apart from it being hard to adapt, and Denis never having a huge hit before, it kept getting scheduled in the most inconvenient release times. But it got lucky due to all the things it was competing against being delayed. I am happy that society at large has now accepted Dune. I am happy you can make a Dune shitpost, and more than 5 people will get it. I am happy that Dune is cool now. I am happy that I'm into Dune now. I am a member of the Dune agenda. I stand Dune. Dune your mom! Alright, I'm obviously out of things to talk about and I want to put an end to this. Now if you excuse me, I am going to get eaten by a worm.
Don't mind if I do!